Okay, so we're going to start the session right now. So thank you everyone that has registered and that you're here for this webinar for S Hits the Fan. For this webinar in particular, we have 4 brands. So first we have Matthew Friedman from the Mekong Club, Sally Peng from FTI Consulting, Antony Crockett from Herbert Smith Freehills, and our host, Dr. Puvan from Bluenumber. So during this webinar, if you have any questions, feel free to put them directly in the chat, and we'll try to get to them either through the session or towards the end of the session with any of the speakers. And so on that note, I'll pass it over to Puvan and enjoy.
Thanks, Nolan. Thank you all for joining us today. And yes, we have got 3 brands, as Nolan had described them. But in fact, I would like to recognize that everyone on this call is an expert in their specific areas. And so the conversation we're going to have today is actually about the topic of social indicators, the S in the ESG. And everyone here on the panel today has had some significant experience in the way that the S has been represented. So that is the purpose of this call. It's a conversation with people who know, perhaps in an area that is not as yet well defined compared to, for example, the environmental aspects of the ESG story. So we will allow everyone to introduce themselves in the course of the presentation. I think that by this time we're all used to the structure of webinars, and you've probably checked everybody out on LinkedIn already. But here we have a very brief overview of who is on the call. I myself am in the space, have been for a while, and have moved into the realm of technology with regard to S indicators and E indicators and so forth. However, for the purposes of this call, I am really the facilitator and the moderator of the opinions that will be shared by Matt, Sally, and Antony. But there is always going to be an underlying technology aspect to the story that we're talking about, and I hope that comes through in the conversation. Up front, I'm going to put on the table that the way that we're approaching this is to discuss things that you would not necessarily find about S simply by Googling, hey, what am I going to do now that I have to report on social indicators? So we hope that we will be able to put some opinions on the table here, which you would not really be able to find if you were to simply read a white paper or worse still, to try to follow one of the various 900 standards that there are out there on how to address the S. Today's conversation is also going to be in the realm of forced labor, child labor, modern slavery, human trafficking, that area of S. These are the concerns, these are the egregious issues, and there are very gray areas on these topics with regard to what should be reported in the S area. It's not so much about health or safety or those things which are under the operational safety and health guidance, which generally speaking is quite well regulated. And it's not necessarily so much about the labor laws. There is actually quite a lot of areas in which, countries in which these laws are quite well documented. The matter of enforcement, of course, is something else completely, but there is a good body of what you could comply with in those areas. But where we're getting into the kind of the gray area, which is these other areas, is what we want to talk about. And in the context of that, I have asked my fellow panelists here, or fellow discussants, to really look at the question of what happens below tier 1. If you on this call are a supply chain manager, you're a buyer, you're an end consumer, you may well know something up to the first person who's selling you that product, the trader or the distributor who is in your country. But when you go beyond that, when you go below that, that's when the problems start to happen. That really is when the S hits the fan. And so that's the question that we've got also on the table today as a background. We've got our first speaker is going to be Antony. I'm going to hand over to you now. Each speaker will be given one slide, and they have some points that they're putting on there. And then we're going to go into a panel questioning about all of this. So Antony, over to you.
Thanks, Puvan. Thanks for having me and inviting me. I'll take the opportunity to just briefly introduce myself. I'm a lawyer with Herbert Smith Freehills in Hong Kong. I lead our business and human rights practice and work with clients in terms of how they establish their policies and their processes around ESG and human rights due diligence, how you then carry that out. And then I think also how you resolve issues when they arise, how you sort out disputes, how you remedy problems. And so the observations I'm going to make are sort of informed by experience working with clients in those areas. And so the first observation I wanted to make, and I think relating to APAC in particular, is, we obviously have currently quite a focus on forced labour. It is a very significant risk. We know from ILO studies and other studies that the scale of the problem is significant in terms of the number of victims, the number of supply chains it impacts is significant in Asia, and in certain parts of Asia, it is really one of the top risks. However, I think something that's happened, and it's happened in particular with the introduction of the modern slavery reporting legislation in the UK and in Australia, which has driven a lot of investment by companies in their supply chain due diligence, but with a focus on forced labour. And it risks overlooking other human rights and social risks, which are significant in this region. And so issues like gender discrimination or racial discrimination, land rights issues, there's a lot of significant human rights risks in the region that affect the supply chain. Now, the point there is that if you have your focus on forced labour and you're ignoring those other risks, you're both, running the risk of having those types of impacts in your supply chain, but you also have a less robust due diligence approach overall. If you're not asking questions about those impacts, it has an impact on your ability to really get to the bottom of what the risks are in the different parts of the supply chain. It's always going to be better not to be looking at these issues in isolation. So that's the first observation. The second one, which really is related, is the APAC region. We have supply chains where we have suppliers who are suppliers to companies in Europe, in the United States, in Australia. We have suppliers who and corporates who are more involved only in trade in Asia. There is quite a significant difference currently in the sophistication of policies and processes in relation to ESG due diligence across the board, but particularly social and human rights due diligence. The challenge that creates for companies is if you have a tier one supplier who is an Asian corporate, then that's not the same as you need to have a really good look at what that supplier's own approach is to due diligence. And you will find gaps that you might not find if you were dealing with a tier one supplier that is European or Australian or from the United Kingdom, for example. And then the third point is this is perhaps an obvious one. The pandemic has created obvious problems and significant problems in our region for effective human rights and social due diligence. And to do social or human rights due diligence well, and particularly in high-risk contexts, it often requires dialogue with impacted communities and rights holders. And, stating the obvious, that the pandemic and the travel restrictions and everything that has gone along with it has just made that much more difficult. And I think in particular because vulnerable communities and people as a general rule don't do Zoom. And then I guess the final observation is some of the political sensitivities in the region around forced labour in particular create obstacles for effective due diligence because of a nervousness of people to ask the questions you need to ask, and to ask those questions of the people you need to ask them of. People, there's a nervousness about just having the conversation, and that's a problem in terms of getting the information you need in order to make an effective assessment of risk and to know what your risks are.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. So, I realize that even in the way that you've presented the problem here, there's always a lot of caveats and nuances and sensitivities and, various ways that we can couch the language. So let me ask you a question with regard to legal compliance. Most of the issues, especially, for example, under your bullet point 1, are already against the law in all of these places. I mean, it's already a serious offense to be doing the things that are being done on these in these places, in these factories by these people. And many of the standards that we're looking at, the voluntary standards, for example, the GP's UN guiding principles, et cetera, already say that legal compliance is insufficient. So all of the people who are involved in perpetrating these crimes, from the factory owner through to the people who are recruiting the workers who are then indebted and all this and the other, are they all guilty of criminal action potentially? And then of all of the people who enable this to happen, so the auditors who don't ask the right questions, who see that these things are happening in the factories but then don't report on them, on the buyers who turn a blind eye, are they all complicit in this crime? Antony.
I'm going to give the classic lawyer's answer. It depends. It depends. It depends where you are. It depends on the law in multiple places. It depends on the law at the end of the supply chain. It depends on the law where you're incorporated, where you're importing goods. But it's definitely, very common in the ESG space, in the business and human rights space, for people to say, well, legal compliance is not enough. That's in the UN guiding principles. You've got to go beyond legal compliance. But then you also see, and it's striking, I think, particularly with forced labour, where we're talking about something that is a serious criminal offence just about everywhere. The lack of attention that's paid to the relevance of law and regulation, and that in terms of how you carry out your due diligence, what questions do you ask, and how is the local and the international legal framework relevant to the questions you should be asking. So for example, retention of travel documents is an indicator of forced labour. Everybody knows that, withholding of passports, etc., by employees. In numerous countries in APAC, that is a criminal offence in itself, to be withholding somebody's passport. And it's a problem because you can be looking at it as an indicator of forced labour, but if you're not also taking into account the fact that if you find someone doing that, you're dealing with a criminal, you start to have some quite serious problems in terms of compliance issues. The other thing that gets overlooked, and this discussion I think is happening more often, is, and there's now a lot of debate about legislation to block the import of products manufactured using forced labour in different places, overlooking some of the existing regulation we have, which makes it a criminal offence to be dealing with products that are produced using forced labour. In a lot of, in Australia, for example, in the United Kingdom, that's likely to be a money laundering offence. And this is always very surprising when clients hear this, because when it's in a supply context, is to say, oh, well, that's something that only banks can be involved in money laundering, or, but it's not correct. The goods produced using modern slavery are the proceeds of crime, potentially. And so you have that issue, and it should inform how you go about the due diligence also, because it's very important in terms of what you do if you find a problem. And it's not to say that you shouldn't be there trying to fix the problems you find in your supply chain, but you have to be conscious of that legal framework that exists and the constraints that it creates. Should you continue dealing with a supplier, for example, you need to be thinking about, if I continue to deal with this supplier now that I know there's a problem, am I involved in money laundering, for example? And I think related to that, this issue of, we have reporting for the purposes of modern slavery legislation, and increasingly you see companies in their modern slavery statements referring to the fact that they have identified actual instances of forced labour. What you don't yet see as a general rule is those issues being then reported to authorities. And I think that's a problem for the medium and longer term. If you're finding that problem, but it's then not being reported to somebody who is going to investigate and prosecute the underlying offending, I don't think we'll ultimately solve the problem in the way that we hope to.
Thanks, Antony. And I'm going to ask, Matt and Sally to also jump in here. But really, what we're looking at is a gap between the law as it is written and justice as it should be served. So my question here is, again, we have criminality that is evidently, demonstrably being perpetrated, and we have a whole group of people who seem to be enabling that to be propagated. I mean, just the very act that you've got people who are now already remediating for crimes that we know have been committed. Companies don't just open up their pocketbook and write checks to people who have not been wronged for one reason or another. I mean, companies are not known for that kind of charitable instance. So therefore, something has definitely gone wrong. So as a question now, the crime has been perpetrated, what happens? And some of this you have spoken to, the ill-gotten gains. Matt, and then Sally, what do you think? Crime and complicity.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the crimes that are on the books that address these types of things, the question is, well, who is going to enforce those crimes or the response to those crimes? The police don't see this as their kind of area. Labor inspectors often are so stretched that they're not able to kind of address this, and usually it doesn't even translate into a legal type of a situation. And so you may have these on the books, but it hasn't and probably won't in the near future translate to criminal activity being identified, especially when you're getting down to something like whether or not passports are being withheld. And I know this because for years we've tried to elicit the police to be a part of the response, and we haven't been able to get them to do that. So part of the problem is that, and it's a general problem across this whole sector, is that modern slavery seems to be something that is a little bit off to the side. It doesn't seem to fall nicely into legal categories, and as a result of that, nobody seems to be taking responsibility for this. And I think that's part of the reason why the transparency legislation is putting so much pressure with each incarnation of transparency legislation to have the brands say more about what they're doing and how they're doing it and how they're addressing these types of things, because it's almost kind of implied that it's going to have to be the brands working with the factories in order to sort these things out, because you're not going to get the legal remedies that are available.
Sally.
Yes, I completely agree with what Antony and also Matt just said, is that the focus, when we're only focusing on forced labor, you really overlook there's a huge flaw that in terms of supply and demand. And if we look at forced labor as a part of a supply chain issue, where a lot of times, which is where my space is more focusing on, unfortunately, is that a lot of clients that they have goods that as a product of forced labor, when they imported goods, they then receive notice from U.S. Customs saying that this product may have forced labor, what do? They don't destroy those goods. They send it back and then order the same type of goods from probably a neighboring factory. That doesn't, resolve the problem. It resolves his problem of that one particular factory, but ultimately the goods still enter U.S. using different way and legal ways too. So that's a sort of an evil cycle of focusing only on goods and not on the human aspect of it.
So we're going to roll straight into your contribution here, Sally. So if you could just introduce yourself for a minute. But if I'm just going to round up on that previous point, and before we lose it completely, over the weekend we had rather kind of sensational event at the Oscars, where obviously by now, if you haven't heard, Will Smith smacked Chris Rock, blah blah blah. Now the interesting thing, one of the side comments of that whole the whole story behind the story was why no one in the theater got up to do anything. Basically one guy got up, walked a distance, smacked someone else, walked back to their seat, sat down. Now, if you're walking along the street and you see somebody beating someone else up on the street, what do you do? And so here, this idea of being complicit, of everybody being, oh yeah, you can be shocked, you can be stunned, you can be all this and the other. But if you really do not take the action, what right do you have? And now the stories are coming out that they want to sanction him, they want to do this and the other. Isn't that a little bit like, oh, here's the slap on the wrist. Why don't you pay all the workers who you have been enslaving for the last 40 years, pay them back their recruitment fees? Oh yeah, okay, well that's cool. Everything's good now. So, this is the kind of the world in which we live. And I'm going to thank both, Mr. Rock and Mr. Smith for bringing out, this point, which in effect, it's happening right in front of us. It's on TV, it's on social media. We can see these crimes. And yet, no one seems to be doing anything about it. Sally, 1 minute of intro from you, and then please tell us what's on your slide.
Sure. What you just said, it's something that we've been reflecting, but it make what I'm about to say seem so trivial because it's focusing more on the business and products. But that is what I do. And my name is Sally, and I'm based in Hong Kong, working for FTI Consulting. I'm U.S. trained attorney focusing on trade, but currently working mostly helping clients, particularly from Asia perspective. When you ship the goods to the U.S. Customs stop your goods. What is it that you can do? Despite the, or in addition to all the comments that Puvan and Antony and Matt has already been put forward, the focus, particularly for the business, what they're seeing is that whatever things that they're doing in the past, meaning that if you think about maybe 5 years, maybe even 10 years ago, what they're a lot of majority of the clients or majority of the importer they were doing is just looking at their tier one supplier, and then they turn their blind eye, knowing that their product is obviously not just from the tier one product suppliers. They have a tier 2, tier 3 as well, and knowing some of the products are coming from problematic area, but they feel their obligation really is to possibly just issue have a contract in their so-called vendor agreement, or in the contract says that you're responsible for everything. Every once in a while, when you hear there's a forced labor in certain countries, certain jurisdictions, certain line of product, then the company probably would do is, or the legal department will ask them to issue another letter, just ask the supplier to sign back. That seemed to be the standard, but what we're seeing and what we're hoping is that standard is no longer acceptable. You need to know your supplier. You also need to know your supplier as a supplier. So it's the same concept already quite acceptable and being held against in bank. You need to know your customer. You also need to know your customer's customer. Why can't we in the supply chain realm to also accept that concept as well? Is something that we've been asking a lot of clients. And the other thing is on the economic side, as always, I think one of the things that I've been a fan of Matt for many years, I listened to quite a few of his speech of his. If the business, especially the buyer in this supply chain demand, sort of relationship. If the business doesn't hurt, they don't do anything. So one of the things is that, right now, if you are using forced labor, even though that you can claim you have no idea where forced labor is in your specific supply chain, you're going to experience disruption in your supply chain. In 2021, the volume, citing forced labor, U.S. Customs has stopped over $500 million US in terms of volume just to stop there, and you don't get to import into US, you don't get to fulfill your contract, you don't get to sell your customer, you don't get to have revenue. So I think that's one thing. I wouldn't say that's the right direction. I think a direction that for a company has to react to. As to me, other than the traditional essence, it is sensitive, which we totally understand, as Antony pointed out too. But just because it's sensitive, it doesn't mean you need to be almost as if you're a deer being caught in line, that you don't do anything, that doing nothing is never an option. So in particular, forced labor, in my line of work, what I'm seeing is that a lot of companies, when they receive the forced labor notification from Customs, instead of talking to their peers and trying to come up with a better way for the entire industry, instead, because they're so worried, and it's a legitimate worry. Again, I recognize that it's a legitimate worry that if they receive so and so, which brand receive a forced labor indication letter, that will be hugely impact their sales, because in the media and everything. But just because of that, not talking to your peer, not talking to form a coalition, to talking to the government to make the industry better, I just don't think this is the right thing to do. And letting government just regulate whichever forced labor standard in this particular round, I feel that if that becomes the reality, then a lot of regulations not going to be practical, and then you're going to be a form over substance rather than the real change.
So Sally, I mean, there are, let's say there is some tension here against some of the the situations in which we are. Companies, as you have said, it's unlikely that they're going to be communicating between each other, because there's obviously a competitive advantage to being able to to keep some of these trade secrets or whatever it is that, however they're going to couch the reason for not talking to each other. The idea of having a pre-competitive space, and we've seen over the last decade or so, a multitude of multi-stakeholder initiatives that have tried to get this kind of foundation together. And for one reason or another, they just have not been as effective as they could have been. Some have sort of succeeded in some sectors. I think maybe in garments, there's been a modicum of success. But in reality, it kind of goes against the grain of what companies are going to be doing with each other. They're not going to sit down and start sharing, their good practices, so that everybody suddenly starts having to incur additional costs because they now have to put all these additional protections in place. And on the other side, you've got governments who actually go out and do global pitches based on the fact that we have a cheap workforce. We now have a volume of people who are willing to work for less than the World Bank a minimum daily wage, which in fact is hardly a living wage. But this is a pitch. Please come and invest in our country because we've got this this huge resource. So there is this tension between these situations. And as you had pointed out, I think in your initial talk, there are so many other ways to get around how it is you want to get your goods into a country, even if, say, for example, a ban has been imposed. So on the basis of this, and now let's say, we as let's say sustainability advisors and social advisors say, look, fix the problem now, because it's going to be a lot cheaper to fix it now than when the S hits the fan, right? Deal with it now. So explain to me why there is no enforcement by the police and the government that's compelling me to do something. Paying the fine is much cheaper than actually doing anything about it. Employing consultants and trying to rework my SOPs is just a total headache. And why don't I just do it for as long as I can get away with it until a ban is imposed? But even if a ban is imposed, I may be able to get my goods in some other way. How does all this work together? What is compelling me to actually make a change?
Right. I'll start with the real example, and again, like we all see why this is happening. Is that as most of you know, the lobbying effort in the U.S. is normal process of governing, and there was one particular lobbyist, which is well known in the footwear industry. All he has, and he represents one well-known footwear industry, footwear importer as well. So he registered as lobbyist in the U.S. You need to register who you're going to lobby and what are you going to lobby. So there was a record of this particular lobbyist making appointment to see one of the senator about the forced labor issue, and then the media, and also particularly social media, which we can understate the power and powerfulness of the social media, portrayed that particular brand having forced labor issue. So that made everyone scared. So this good example, another good example is right now there's actually a U.S. government is soliciting comments from everyone under the sun. Feel free to come in and tell me what I need to do in order to make this a better enforcement. Everything, anything you want to tell. But if you look at the comment, which the comment period ends about a week ago, I don't see any brand making comments, even though they're probably knows everything there is no technology available or technology challenging part of it, or whatever things happening in their supply chain. But you don't see them submitting comment. What you do though, you see the technology company making comments for their own business, or some other lobbying entity or advisor, like you said, are putting together comments on perhaps on behalf clients that are anonymous. So it is that area where if any company do come forward and they're going to get headline coverage, and that's not something that they can afford to. So that's a real challenge for majority of the company. But on the flip side, just like you said, Puvan, is that does that mean that it should stop us from doing the right thing? No, but the good thing is there's a lot of company, despite not talking to people, not letting people know all these effort, they are doing them because they know there will be experienced disruption in the supply chain, and they also it's their motto, their commitment to do better.
So Antony and then Matt, I think Antony first. What I would like to know is, let's say let's couch it in all the legal speak and all the caveats that need to be couched, right? But you're faced with a situation where a client has got a problem, and the problem has now been pushed into the court of public opinion. It's out there, it's on TV. The guy slapped someone else in the face. So what do you do now? As someone who is in the realm, you've got both camps. You're an ethical practitioner and you want to see the right thing done, but you have to lay all the options out for your client. What is the advice that you're giving them? Are you saying, listen, fix the problem now, be transparent, own up to the sins, make good on the remedies, and then you're going to be good in the long term, which is a standard sustainability consultant advisor's approach? Or do you say, listen, legally speaking, you need to hunker down, say nothing, be quiet, lawyer up, go after the activist?
Look, I definitely think when you find a problem, the first thing you should think about is, can that be remedied? The legal considerations, though, in terms of the offending that may be occurring and everything, should be part of the discussion and the assessment of how do you remedy this problem. Because, making sure that somebody gets their passport back or making sure that somebody gets paid the recruitment fee back, etc., that doesn't mean that the offence, for example, hasn't been committed. And the problem you have with the fact that you've identified offending is that you're in business or in your supply chain is somebody who is a serious criminal offender. And we're not talking about, these are not misdemeanors. These are very serious offences that, in many places will see you go to prison for more than 10 years. And that there remains a degree of naivety about will fix the problem, which is that the victims will get some compensation. And that is very, very important. But let's be clear, you're not fixing the problem. You know, the problem of, you know, dealing with people who are recidivists, and often we're talking about recidivists, you know, people who set up enterprises to exploit people tend not to be in it for the one-off opportunity. It tends to be a business model that is perpetrated, and, you know, we'll set up a new company here, we'll set up a new factory there. That's often the pattern you find in the serious case. And so you absolutely should be looking to, you know, remedy the problem in terms of the harm that's been caused to victims, but you also should be thinking about that longer term issue. Now, for some clients, you know, to be very honest, I'll say too, how important is this to you to continue having this supply from this supplier or from this, you know, country? Because if you want to make sure this supply chain can continue to be part of your supply chain, you're going to have to address this serious problem you have. And you know, paying some money back to people is not addressing the serious problem you have. And I'm always very suspicious when then I hear somebody saying, "Oh, we've spoken to the, you know, the factory owner and they're going to sort it out." You know, that to me as a lawyer, that makes me, you know, extremely suspicious. And so that's, and there's an interesting question in the chat too about, you know, this becomes political. Modern slavery is a political term. I mean, it's, you know, again, it's very, you know, lawyer's way to approach it. There's nothing modern about modern slavery, and the definition in the Australian reporting legislation, the term refers to a range of offences which relate, you know, go back to ILO conventions from, you know, 1929. And it's a very simple concept. Forced labour is somebody being coerced, is someone working against their will. And that's why I go back to the point about, you know, thinking through the legal issue is important, and thinking about this not only in terms of slavery, you know, do you have problems with gender discrimination? Do you have problems with racial discrimination, discrimination against migrant workers? You've got to ask those questions because it's relevant to the question of, do you have workers in your supply chain who are being coerced? And it, you know, that's really useful information to get, you know, how are people being treated? In some cases, you know, being very legal about it, you'll also be able to make an analysis to say, this is not forced labour, but nevertheless, this is a, you know, serious problem. The treatment of people is unacceptable and we need to sort it out. So it's not always even that you're going to, often you can conclude that it's not forced labour. It's serious mistreatment of workers and it needs to be remedied. And that's then a different scenario where you maybe have a little bit more flexibility as well in terms of how you deal with it, compared to the situation where you've actually found something and concluded that that is, you know, real criminal forced incidents of forced labour.
Thanks, Anthony. So let's take that point. And Matt, can you just comment on the semantics of this? And then let's also say, look, whichever way we define it, and we come back to the idea of justice, something being wrong, that there is justice. How suspicious are you when somebody says, hey, I'm going to try to fix this problem? Yeah, sure. You know, I'm making my claims, I'm doing my audits, I'm doing this, that, and the other. So we've got a lot of places where people can hide, you know, in the language and in reality. What's your thoughts?
I'm going to go back to your metaphor about Will Smith and Chris Rock. You know, Will went up there, slapped him. Nobody did anything because they never really had anything like that happen before and they weren't prepared for it. So much of the way I look at this and the way my organization works at this is to go to the brands and to the contractors and subcontractors and say, this is a real world potential issue that if you don't look at it and plan and prepare and get ready for the possibility of this happening, then you might find yourself in a situation where you're on the front page of a newspaper or BBC is doing an expose on you. So having said that, you know, they develop a plan and everybody comes together and they debate and discuss and they pull things together. And then it happens and they're still not prepared because they haven't internalized the emotional potential impact of that. And so that's why we do crisis management workshops with organizations to help them to understand the real world situation of what happens if something like this occurs. Because, you know, the way the workshop works is that you basically are given a group of people and a set of scenarios, and then 15 minutes after, then you get another factor and another factor, and all of a sudden there's that wake up moment. Wow, we're really not prepared for this type of a situation. And that's the kind of thing that I've seen over and over again when I do remediation with different organizations, is they feel like they did the prep work, they feel like they moved into it, but not enough to really get them to a point where they're really prepared for these types of things. And so it's exactly as you say. You'll get a call from the legal person calling everybody in, there's scurrying, maybe we're called in or another organization. They explain what the situation is, and then you try to make the best of a worst situation. And a lot of it has to do with making sure that you kind of limit the exposure of this particular thing. But at the same time, and probably more importantly, what do you do to make sure that it's fixed and fixed right so it doesn't happen again? And one of the things that I have to say is that, you know, when I first started working with the private sector, people would say the private sector is inherently evil. They'll use slaves for state shareholder profits and everything else. That's not the case. We know that. A company will do anything and everything they can to protect their business, but most companies haven't really been looking below tier 1, as you rightly pointed out, Puvan. Now the expectation is that with legislation, you have to go all the way down to the lowest level, but a lot of companies are struggling with how to go about doing that. They go from 1,400 audits to now 5,000 audits. Who's going to pay for that? And so actually there are companies that are coming together and sharing audit information. And that's the trend we will begin to see, because it's too cumbersome to expect that one company is going to audit every aspect of tier 3, from 1 to tier 3. The summary of all of this is to basically say it really still comes down to the fact that despite the fact the legal system says you've done a crime, nobody's getting arrested for this. Nobody's really being put in jail. The court of public opinion seems to be where the liability is for organizations, but up until now, even that hasn't really played out in a way that's made a lot of changes.
Okay, so you know we've got the shock, we've got the recoil, we've got the all of those factors which you had mentioned, and we've got the fact that we simply cannot afford to audit everyone all the time. It's just not practicable, and it's cost prohibitive. And let's say if companies are driven by two things, they just want a license to operate, to do what they need to do at the lowest cost possible. And up until this point in time, that cost, that low cost, has come with the free pass to, you don't need to know anything that's going on below tier 1. However, you can get that raw good or that commodity, and Sally, as you had said, that product that is coming in. If it's the lowest possible cost, I don't need to know. I'm going to ship my my production offshore to to anywhere, as long as it comes back with the right specifications and the right quality content and meets my performance standards, I'm all good. So now we've got a slew of legislation that's coming in that says, well, that's just not going to cut it anymore, especially in the EU. So you've got stuff that is coming up that says that you need to know everything that's going on all the way down to the end, because you will be liable, not only as a company, but also as individuals on your board, as directors. And you could be taken to task, as Antony had mentioned, for all of these ill-gotten gains for however long it's been. So this idea, and we can match this up with the idea of reparations, which has never been fully addressed in the US. And even, for example, when Kate and William were over in the Caribbean last week, and William gave a speech about being very sorry for stuff, but somebody pointed out, but he didn't actually apologize for what actually happened with slavery in the Caribbean. So we're getting to that point where the global social consciousness is already up there, and there are going to be some serious issues that could be tied if you do not know what's below tier 1. So where do we go from here? Sally, I mean, you are advising companies. What really what really can a company do and what must they do before their insurance premiums go up to say, listen, you are like a high risk venture, buddy?
I'm going to still focusing on the good side, and then again, I recognize that the flaw of not looking at the human aspect, but at least for the company in the supply chain business, that they really need to have a traceability system. It's not something that it's nice to have; it's must have, and this is need to be from the top down and then from down to bottom type of down to up type of thing. That the traceability system that need to have a policy, a very clear policy, which I think Antony will address even more so. You need to have a policy that's practical and also commitment from the management to be able to implement those policy. Lots of trainings. I still think that training and talking and communication is a very important part, particularly for APAC region. The culture difference, the language difference really is there that need to be addressed and then be able to put in a lot of effort. This is where Matt is the master on this front. And last thing I would probably said, like what Puvan probably, in the beginning already pointed to, is technology. Technology is to a point, it's evolving to a point that you really need to have a system, you need to have a platform. Almost like a lot of business that we're seeing these days, that you can implement certain part of a technology into your supply chain to be able to increase the visibility and control point to help you, to help you manage this issue and manage the risk down the road as well.
So let's just move on to this idea of tech. Matt, we have been working on the idea of tech that is actually going bottom up. You've been closely involved in this. Can you tell us a little bit about your views on worker voice, the necessity to actually supplement audits, which are traditionally top down, into a company's decision-making process to what's actually happening in their chain? And then immediately following, Antony, what would be the implication of now having worker voice in part and parcel of the evidence that is supplied to a company from, let's say, a legal standpoint with regard to the prospect of prosecution? So Matt first.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use some of my public health experience, which I did for many, many years, where I was in Nepal and we would do the equivalent of what would be an audit that you see of a brand, but a hospital and a health clinic. And generally what we ended up doing was filling out, 600 or 700 different questions. And then by the time we got to a point where we were determining if there was an issue or not, we would try to go and talk to the employees, but they're not there because they've all left because we spent so much time on this pro forma stuff. What we came to realize was that if audits are used for the purpose of basically solving problems, we weren't solving problems. And so what we did is we scrapped 400 or 500 of the questions and got it down to what are the things that we think are most relevant. And then we just focused in on that, and then went to the patients themselves and started interviewing them. And then we came to realize as a result of that process that now we had our finger on the pulse of what's happening. Now segue over to a standard kind of supply chain audit. Problem is it's 600 questions and you have to do almost the same thing over and over again, when in fact that's not needed. It's already been done 50 times. Why can't we just focus in on what are the potential proxies for issues and problems that might exist that you can then go deeper in by asking the people who are potentially most vulnerable, the workers themselves. So one tool that we've developed is called the Apprise app. And the way it works is that, I don't have it on this phone, but an auditor basically goes up to a migrant within an organization and there's flags on the front of it. They press the flag from where they come from. They have headphones on, and then in their language, they're told, we're going to ask you a bunch of questions. The answer to the question is yes, press green, no, press red. We'll throw some health and safety questions in there. They don't know why they're being asked these questions, but questions like, are you indebted? Do you have your passport? Do you have the ability to leave? Are basically asked as part of this process. And as a result of this simple triage tool, you're able to significantly increase the potential insight into whether or not there's ILO issues in that particular location. That plus other forms of worker voice technology that allows workers to feel like they are in control of the fact that they can answer questions when they want, in a place other than the factory, allows for the possibility of more data to be made available so that you can triangulate whether or not there's a potential issue within an organization or not. So I think we just have to kind of almost give up the idea of thinking that the bureaucracy of audits have to be the same way every time, and look at audits 2.0 or to 3.0, I don't know where we are in the process, to see whether or not we can be more creative in the way that we go and find issues and problems at the locations we're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, naturally, I would agree that, that we have got to upgrade the audit system. We can't do away with audits altogether in the sense that, there are technical audits, there are other aspects that need to be studied. But certainly when it comes to the social framework, there is so much which we are missing out on, as an opportunity which the technology provides to us. So we're going to ask, so we've got about 10 minutes left. Antony, I am interested in this question with regard to unjust enrichment. There is a case that is going through the courts in the UK now with regard to a manufacturer in Malaysia. No point keeping it secret, it's already in the courts. It's Dyson and some of their workers that are looking at that unjust enrichment that happened during the period that they were being exploited. And also there is a question in the chat that talks about what happens when these things are uncovered. I mean, how do you react? Because companies naturally will have a fear of being taken to court, of having a reputational risk. Where are we at with regard to, look, keeping secret may not be the best way to go. What are your thoughts on this and the court case?
Yeah, look, to I guess link it to what Matt was talking about too, with where, there's a lot of innovation going on with respect to, gathering data, and there's a real focus, certainly a lot of my clients, one of the things they're always asking is, what's out there that we can use that will get us data, that will tell us what the risks are. And there's that focus on that risk identification part of due diligence. And due diligence, and the concept from the UN Guiding Principles is not just about identifying the risk, it's also about the actions you take once you've identified the risk. And that's where I think there's often a sort of lack of attention and lack of work done in terms of, well, we'll collect all of this information, but have we got clear in our minds what our policies are, who are the responsible people, and how will we use that information, and what will we do when we discover problems? And one of the things I find really striking is just how much information companies, particularly large companies, have about the supply chain. It's not the case that they don't know what's going on. In many cases, they have extremely detailed information. So they have payroll data, they have the data on the number of hours people are working, they have production cost kind of, data that they collect. And this, though, is sometimes being collected for different purposes. So if you want to run a really efficient manufacturing operation, you want to have all that data because you want to keep control of your cost of production, what have you. That's all being collected by the company. They may then be collecting some worker voice data, but that sits somewhere else. Do the two things get, do you correlate the two things? And I've had clients where you look at what they've got and then say, well, what you have got is a dossier of information that shows you that you have potential forced labor going on, because you've got the hours, you've got the payroll, you've got this worker voice data. And the problem is it's not been, triangulated, and a decision has not been taken. And, from the perspective of then your legal exposure, you've got that information sitting in the company that will prove the case for the prosecutor, or will prove the case for the claimants that, you knew what was going on, or you ought to have known what was going on because you had the information you needed to draw that conclusion. And so I think, I always say, by all means, spend a lot of money, build a system, buy some subscriptions that will get you all of this data, but you really need to think very carefully about what you do with it. And there's all of this, there's a lot of excitement about how this can all be automated and digitized, but a human being, at the end of the day, in most of these situations where you discover problems, human beings need to make decisions about what to do with the information. And that's something where I think is often a gap in organizations in terms of how they, who is responsible, who is the person who should be making the call. And then when it gets to the transparency point, there'll be some questions to ask from a legal perspective. Do you have an obligation to report it? And in a lot of cases you do, and your obligation to report it is not in your modern slavery statement. It's under the local legislation. So Malaysia, for example, if you are aware of trafficking or forced labour offences in Malaysia, there is a positive obligation to report that. And then in the context of where you're at the end of the supply chain, you're bringing the products in, for example, to the United Kingdom. If you have a suspicion that they are produced using forced labour, you need to consider very carefully whether you should be reporting that to the National Crime Agency. And people don't do it. If you don't report it, what's your defence going to be when somebody comes and asks you about it? And something I said to a client that reported an incident of modern slavery in their modern slavery statement was, what's the chairman going to say when he's asked a question about that at the AGM? Because the question at the AGM will be, so you discovered it, what did you do then? And you better have an answer to what did you do then? So the transparency is admirable, but of course it's going, for a lawyer, it always leads to the next question. What did you do about it? And that's really, really important. There's no point having all of the information, all of the data, if you haven't got clear in your mind what we're going to do with it.
I think that's exactly right. So the situation now is, where we are in the realm of great exploration. We have got technologies that are going to be able to draw that map for us, put the right information on the map, give us all the tools in which we need to make a decision. Then the decision comes down to, is it going to be something we have to comply with? And we already know that from a legal perspective, generally speaking, there are enough gaps and loopholes between countries and across international laws that no one is really held accountable for anything. And it could take years before you get any sort of justice or compensation or remediation. Even when the remediation then happens, it does not necessarily allow for a clawback so that you can ensure that you have got reparations and ill-gotten gains. By this time, victims of these issues, who knows what will have happened. So you've also got that whole kind of like the time factor, the urgency factor, which is lost in our governance processes. And even when I was on the working group for business and human rights, one of the issues was always access to remedy. And when we look at Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, whether it's the state duty or a corporate's responsibility to respect, unless you've got access to remedy, then you can actually get satisfaction delivered to victims quickly so that their suffering is eased from day one. It becomes a very, very kind of, let's say, academic proposition on how it is that we're dealing with things. But certainly Sally's point, which is, look, let's get the transparency done. Matt's point, which is let's get the worker voice in. And then Antony, which is have an answer to the question. Because now when you put those things out, you do need to be ready with what you're going to do next. And all of this, I mean, I would say, to add my own kind of 2 cents worth, is not something that you can afford to do in secret anymore, because somebody's going to find out. There's going to be a January 6th committee happening somewhere. And at some point, somebody's going to find out that you are writing those texts to somebody. You were sending that internal memo to somebody. And, the workers, went home and they were paid off, in some form. So none of this is ever, especially in this age of advanced technology and so forth, is never going to be secret. So maybe we need to really up our game on transparency. So we're coming to the end. We've got 1 minute left. I'd just like to thank everybody, Sally, Matt, Antony. That's, I think it's a great conversation. This is a series that we're going to continue with people who know the S hits the fan. I also want to just acknowledge that in the chat, there have been several questions with regard to particular communities in particular countries, China, for example. That's not really what, this is not to give you advice on how to do anything. However, I would encourage, please do speak to Antony, Sally, and Matt, all of whom are experts on the China situation and on all of the supply lines that are coming from there. I'm sure that if you reach out to them, they'll be able to help you actually solve some of those problems and give you some advice. So thank you so much. We're going to wrap it up here.
Thank you, everyone. And just at the end there, you'll have a quick survey. We appreciate your feedback for future events. Thank you.
Thank you.